Every morning, before the first light of dawn touched the sky, 10-year-old James was already up and out of the door, a stack of newspapers under his arm. The streets of his small town in Ohio were still asleep as he made his rounds, delivering papers to the porches of houses that wouldn't wake for hours. His little sister, Sophie, was always on his mind as he worked. She was still asleep back home, her breathing heavy and labored, a constant reminder of the heart condition that threatened her life every day. James lived with Sophie in a tiny, worn-down apartment on the edge of town. Their parents had died in a car crash when James was too young to remember much about them. Since then, it had just been him and Sophie against the world. At 10, James was already burdened with responsibilities far beyond his years, but he faced them with a determination that came from knowing he was all Sophie had. Sophie was everything to James. Her illness, though severe, never took the smile from her face, especially when James came home after his early morning route. She would greet him with a warmth that made every bit of his exhaustion worth it. But James knew that Sophie's time was running out. The doctors had been clear. She needed a heart transplant, and soon. But the cost was astronomical, far more than a paperboy like James could ever hope to afford. Despite the odds, James refused to give up. Every penny he earned was carefully saved in a jar he kept hidden in the back of their kitchen cupboard. It wasn't much, but it was all he could do. Each day, after finishing his deliveries, he would take a moment to count his savings, wondering how much longer he could keep Sophie's hopes alive with so little. But in his heart, he knew he couldn't stop. As long as there was even a sliver of hope, he would keep fighting for her. On his way home, as the sun began to rise, James always passed by a toy store. In the window was a beautiful teddy bear, soft and plush, with a ribbon around its neck. He knew Sophie would love it, but it was a luxury he couldn't afford. There was no room for such things when every cent had to go towards saving her life. Finally, after a long and tiring morning, James arrived home. The apartment was still and quiet as he entered. Sophie was still asleep, her small frame barely making a dent in the old bed they shared. He walked over to her, gently tucking the blankets around her thin shoulders, watching her chest rise and fall with each labored breath. For a moment, she seemed so peaceful, and it was easy to forget how serious her condition really was. Sitting by her side, James whispered, "I'm going to save you, Sophie. I promise." His voice was soft, filled with a fierce determination that belied his years. As he sat there, the weight of his promise heavy in the stillness of the room, he knew that no matter how impossible it seemed, he would never give up on her. The days blended into one another as James continued his exhausting routine. Each morning, he would rise before the sun, slipping out of the apartment as quietly as he could so as not to wake Sophie. He would carefully close the door behind him, then set off on his paper route through the still sleeping town. His legs ached from the constant walking, and his arms were sore from carrying the heavy stack of newspapers, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the promise he had made to Sophie, to save her no matter what. At school, James struggled to stay awake. His teachers had noticed his drooping eyelids and how he often fell asleep in class, but they attributed it to the long hours he spent working. They knew James was doing everything he could to take care of his sister, and while they were concerned, they also understood there wasn't much they could do. But James never complained. He didn't tell anyone how tired he was or how much he missed the days when he could just be a kid. His thoughts were always on Sophie and the jar of money he kept hidden at home. Sophie, though confined to bed most of the time, never stopped encouraging James. She knew how hard he was working and how much he was sacrificing for her. Despite her illness, she tried to be as cheerful as possible whenever James was around. She didn't want him to worry any more than he already did. She knew he was doing everything he could, and that was all she could ask for. One afternoon, as James sat at the kitchen table counting his savings, Sophie watched him from her bed. Her big eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and worry, followed every movement of his hands as he carefully sorted through the coins and bills. "Is it enough yet, James?" Sophie asked softly, her voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. James paused, his heart tightening at the question. He knew they were still far from having enough for the surgery, but he didn't want to dampen her spirits. "Not yet, Soph," he replied, forcing a smile as he looked over at her. But we're getting there. Every day, we're getting a little closer. Sophie smiled weakly, nodding as if to reassure herself as much as him. I know you'll make it happen, James. You always do. Her faith in him was unshakable, and that was what kept James going. But deep down, he couldn't shake the fear that he might not be able to keep his promise. The medical bills were already piling up, and the cost of a heart transplant seemed like an insurmountable mountain. Even with his daily earnings, it would take years to save enough, and Sophie didn't have years. James often thought about asking for help, but he didn't know where to turn. The neighbors were kind, but they were struggling too. The thought of going to the hospital and begging for charity felt too humiliating, and he didn't want Sophie to know how desperate things really were. Instead, he kept pushing forward, working harder each day, hoping for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing week. That evening, after finishing his homework, James returned to his sister's side. Sophie was sleeping soundly, her breathing shallow but steady. He sat quietly by her bed, watching over her as he had done so many times before. The room was filled with the soft sounds of the night outside, and for a moment, everything felt calm. I'll find a way, Sophie, James whispered into the darkness. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. Sophie was all he had, and he was all she had. They had to keep going, had to keep fighting, no matter how impossible it seemed. The thought of losing her was too much to bear, and it fueled a fire inside him that nothing could extinguish. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, James was determined to save his sister, because without her, he didn't know how to live. The days grew colder as winter approached, but James' routine never changed. Every morning, he wrapped himself in an old coat that was too big for him, pulling the sleeves over his hands to keep out the biting wind. The mornings were darker now, the cold seeping into his bones as he trudged through the town, delivering newspapers with the same determination that had driven him since Sophie's diagnosis. School became increasingly difficult for James. He was constantly exhausted, his mind struggling to keep up with his schoolwork. His teachers tried to be understanding, but they worried about him. Mrs. Henderson, his fifth-grade teacher, had taken him aside one afternoon, her kind eyes filled with concern. James, she said gently, I know you're going through a lot, but you need to take care of yourself too. You can't help Sophie if you get sick or fall behind in school. James nodded, understanding her words, but knowing he had no other choice. I'm okay, Mrs. Henderson, he replied, forcing a small smile. I just need to keep going. Mrs. Henderson wanted to press further, to offer help, but she saw the determination in his eyes. She knew that James wouldn't accept charity, not out of pride, but because he felt it was his responsibility to take care of Sophie. So, instead, she gave him a gentle pat on the shoulder and sent him back to class, her heart heavy with worry. At home, Sophie's condition continued to worsen. She was now too weak to get out of bed, her days spent lying down, propped up by pillows. James did everything he could to make her comfortable, bringing her water, helping her with her medication, and reading to her from the few books they had in their small apartment. He tried to keep her spirits up, even as the weight of their situation pressed down on him. One evening, after a particularly long day, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at the jar where he kept his savings. It was still so far from what they needed. His hands trembled as he picked up the jar, feeling the coins and crumpled bills shift inside. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But James couldn't allow himself to think like that. He couldn't afford to lose hope, not when Sophie needed him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed a plan. He needed to find a way to earn more money, but he was already stretched to his limit. The next day, after school, James decided to take a different route on his paper deliveries. Instead of heading straight home, he made his way to the busier part of town. The businesses there were always bustling with people, and James thought that maybe, just maybe, he could find a few extra customers willing to buy a paper. As he walked through the crowded streets, he felt a mix of hope and anxiety. He was venturing into unfamiliar territory, but desperation drove him forward. He approached several shopkeepers, offering his newspapers with a polite smile and a quiet voice. Most people simply waved him away, too busy to notice the small, determined boy standing before them. But then, as he was about to give up and head home, he heard a voice call out to him. "Hey kid, over here." James turned to see a woman standing in front of a small, brightly lit bakery. She was wearing a white coat, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She had a kind face, with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "You selling newspapers?" she asked, wiping her hands on a flour-covered apron. James nodded, his heart racing. "Yes, ma'am. Would you like to buy one?" The woman chuckled softly. "I'll take a few, and you can sell them here every afternoon if you'd like. This corner gets a lot of foot traffic, and I'm sure you'll find more customers." James could hardly believe his luck. "Thank you, ma'am. That would help a lot." The woman handed him a few dollars and took the newspapers, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small bag. "Here," she said, passing it to James. "It's a little something for you and your sister. Freshly baked cookies. You look like you could use a treat." James took the bag, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just the money or the cookies. It was the kindness she showed him, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. As James walked home that evening, the cold wind biting at his cheeks, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. He clutched the bag of cookies tightly, thinking of Sophie's face when he gave them to her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days brought a sense of new energy to James' routine. Each afternoon, after school, he would make his way to the bakery where the woman, whose name he learned was Anne, always greeted him with a smile. The spot turned out to be as promising as Anne had said. More and more people began to recognize James, and soon he was selling more newspapers than ever before. The few extra dollars he made each day were small steps toward his goal, but they were steps nonetheless. And the baker was unlike anyone James had ever met. She was warm, friendly, and always had a kind word for him. She didn't pry into his life, but it was clear she noticed the weight he carried on his small shoulders. Every afternoon, she'd hand him a bag with a treat inside, cookies, a muffin, or sometimes even a slice of pie. "For you and Sophie," she'd say with a smile, and each time, James would thank her as though she'd just given him the world. One chilly November afternoon, as the sun was setting and James was packing up his remaining newspapers, and stepped out of the bakery and sat down next to him on the bench where he waited for the bus home. She handed him the usual bag of treats, but this time, she didn't walk away immediately. "You're a hard worker, James," and said, her voice gentle. "Not many kids your age would be out here every day like this." James looked down at his feet, unsure how to respond. He was used to being unnoticed, not praised, and continued, "I don't want to pry, but I can see that you're doing this for more than just pocket money. Is everything okay at home?" James hesitated, then nodded, though it felt like a lie. "It's just me and my sister," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's sick. I'm trying to save up for her." The concern in Anne's eyes deepened. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone so young," she said softly. "Have you thought about asking for help? There are people who can." "I can't," James interrupted, his voice firm despite the tremble in it. "I have to do this myself. Sophie depends on me," and nodded slowly, understanding the determination and pride in his words. She didn't push further, sensing that James wasn't ready to open up completely, but she also knew she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "Well, I think you're doing an amazing job, James," and said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But you don't have to do it all alone. If you ever need anything at all, you just let me know, okay?" James looked up at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He blinked them back quickly and nodded. "Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate that," and smiled warmly. "I'm serious, James. Don't hesitate to ask. And if you ever need a little extra money, you can help me out in the bakery on weekends. It's not much, but it's something." The offer caught James by surprise. He had never thought of working in a bakery, but the idea of earning more money, and more importantly, feeling less alone, was tempting. "I'd like that," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Great," and said, standing up, "We'll start this Saturday. Come by in the morning, and I'll show you the ropes." As James boarded the bus home, the bag of treats clutched in his hand, he couldn't help but feel a little lighter. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had something to look forward to. It wasn't just the extra money that made him feel hopeful. It was the knowledge that someone cared, that someone was willing to help him, even if he wasn't quite ready to accept it fully. When he got home, Sophie was awake, her face lighting up as James walked through the door. "What did you bring today?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. James grinned, opening the bag to reveal a pair of warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies. "From Anne," he said, handing one to Sophie. Sophie took the cookie and sniffed it, her eyes wide with delight. She must be the best baker in the world. James chuckled as he bit into his own cookie, the warmth of the chocolate spreading through him like a hug. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think she might be." That night, as Sophie drifted off to sleep, James sat by her bed, feeling more hopeful than he had in a long time. The world didn't seem as cold and lonely as it had before. He had a new friend in and someone who believed in him and was willing to help. It was a small thing, but to James, it felt like a lifeline. "I'll make it work, Sophie," he whispered into the darkness. "I'll save you. I promise." And for the first time, that promise didn't feel quite so impossible. The following Saturday, James woke up early, just as he did every morning. But this time, instead of heading out with his newspapers, he made his way to the bakery. The morning air was crisp, and the town was still quiet. But inside the bakery, the warmth and the smell of freshly baked bread greeted him like an old friend, and was already there, bustling around in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour. She looked up as James entered, her face breaking into a wide smile. "Morning, James. Ready to get to work?" James nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. He had never worked in a place like this before, but he was eager to learn. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, trying to sound confident, and laughed softly. "No need to be so formal, James. Just call me in. Now, let's get you started. Ever made bread before?" James shook his head, and in motion for him to come closer. "Well, today's your lucky day. It's easier than you might think, and it's actually kind of fun. Let's start with something simple." She handed him an apron and showed him how to roll up his sleeves. As they began working side by side, kneading dough and shaping it into loaves, and talked him through each step, her voice calm and encouraging. James found himself relaxing, the steady rhythm of the work helping to ease the tension he always carried in his chest. The morning passed quickly, and before long, the bakery was filled with the rich, comforting smell of freshly baked bread. Customers began trickling in, and handled them with ease, all the while keeping an eye on James, making sure he was doing okay. During a lull in the rush, and turned to James and handed him a small envelope. "This is for today's work," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "You did a great job, James. I'm really impressed." James took the envelope, surprised by the weight of it. "Thank you, Anne," he said, trying to hide his amazement. He had never earned this much in a single day before, and nodded, her expression growing serious for a moment. "James, I meant what I said the other day. If you ever need anything at all, you can come to me. I know you're doing your best to take care of Sophie, but you don't have to carry that burden all by yourself." James felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't used to people offering help, and he wasn't sure how to accept it. But something in Anne's voice, in the way she looked at him, made him believe she genuinely cared. "I appreciate that, Anne," he said, his voice quiet. "I really do," and reached out and gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're a good kid, James, and I know you'll do whatever it takes for Sophie. But remember, you're not alone in this, okay?" James nodded, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. He had spent so long thinking that he had to face everything on his own, but Anne's kindness was starting to chip away at that belief. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it all by himself. As James left the bakery that afternoon, the envelope tucked safely in his pocket, he felt a sense of hope that had been absent for far too long. The extra money would go a long way towards Sophie's medical bills, but more than that, knowing that someone else cared made a world of difference. When he got home, Sophie was waiting for him with a smile. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. James pulled out the envelope and showed it to her. "It was great, and even paid me for today's work. This is going to help a lot." Sophie's eyes sparkled with happiness. "See? I told you things would get better." James couldn't help but smile at her optimism. "Yeah, you were right." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, James telling Sophie about his day at the bakery and Sophie listening with rapt attention. It was the most relaxed he had felt in months, and for a few precious hours, they could forget about the weight that usually hung over them. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, James sat at the kitchen table and carefully counted the money from the envelope. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than he had hoped for. He added it to the jar, feeling a small but significant sense of accomplishment. They were still far from their goal, but for the first time, it felt like they were making progress. As he put the jar back in its hiding place, James allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Maybe things were starting to turn around. Maybe, with Anne's help, they could really make it. But as he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, James knew there were still many challenges ahead. The path they were on was long and uncertain, but for Sophie's sake, he would walk it to the end. And now, at least, he didn't have to walk it alone. As the weeks passed, James settled into a new routine. Mornings were still dedicated to his paper route, and after school, he spent his afternoons at Anne's bakery. The extra money he earned was slowly but steadily adding up, and with each passing day, his hope grew stronger. But despite the progress, there was still a gnawing fear in the back of his mind. A fear that time might run out before he could save Sophie. One chilly afternoon, as James was wiping down the counter in the bakery, the bell above the door jingled, signaling a customer. He looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but instead, he saw a woman he had never seen before. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, and she walked with a certain grace that caught his attention. There was something about her, a familiarity that James couldn't quite place. As she approached the counter, her eyes briefly met his, and for a split second, James felt a jolt of recognition, though he couldn't figure out why. "Good afternoon," she said with a warm smile. "I'll take a loaf of your sourdough, please." James nodded, quickly wrapping up the bread and handing it to her. "Here you go," he said, still trying to shake the strange feeling that had come over him. As she took the bread, her gaze lingered on James for a moment longer than usual. "You look a lot like someone I used to know," she said softly, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. James' heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he asked, unable to hide his curiosity. The woman smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "My sister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She passed away a few years ago." James felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm sorry," he said, not knowing what else to say. The woman shook her head, as if trying to dismiss the memories. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steadying. "It's just strange how life brings back familiar faces in unexpected places." James watched as she paid for the bread and turned to leave, but something stopped him from letting her go without asking. "What was her name?" "Your sister." The woman paused at the door, her hand on the knob. She looked back at James, her expression softening. "Her name was Lily," she said, her eyes distant. "Lily Sullivan." The name hit James like a lightning bolt. Sullivan. His mother's maiden name was Sullivan. His mind raced as he tried to process the information. Could this woman somehow be related to him and Sophie? Before he could say anything more, the woman smiled one last time and stepped out of the bakery, leaving James standing there, frozen with shock. Anne, who had been working in the back, came out just as the door closed behind the woman. "James? Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." James turned to Anne, his heart pounding in his chest. "That woman," she said her sister's name was Lily Sullivan. "That's my mom's name." Anne's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" James nodded, his mind still reeling. What if she's family? What if she could help Sophie? And placed a hand on James' shoulder, sensing the storm of emotions he was going through. "It's possible, James, but we don't know for sure. Do you remember anything about your mom's family?" James shook his head. "No, she never talked about them. I always thought it was just me, Sophie, and our parents. I didn't know there was anyone else." Anne's face was thoughtful. "It might be worth looking into, James. Maybe this woman knows more than she let on." James felt a mix of hope and anxiety bubbling up inside him. If this woman was truly related to him and Sophie, it could change everything. But the thought of finding out more also scared him. What if it led to disappointment? What if she wasn't who he hoped she might be? Do you think she'll come back? James asked, his voice trembling slightly, and nodded. People who love our sourdough usually do. And when she does, maybe you could ask her more about her family. James nodded, though his mind was already spinning with possibilities. For the rest of the day, he could barely focus on his work, his thoughts consumed by the woman who had walked into the bakery and left behind a trail of questions. That night, as he sat by Sophie's bedside, watching her sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. He didn't know what it was or when it would come, but the encounter with the mysterious woman had stirred something deep within him, something that felt a lot like hope. And for James, hope was something he couldn't afford to lose. The days that followed felt like an eternity to James. Every time the bell above the bakery door jingled, his heart would leap in his chest, only to sink when it wasn't the woman he had met, and noticed how distracted he had become, how his eyes would constantly dart to the door, his mind clearly somewhere else. Still thinking about that woman? And asked gently one afternoon as she kneaded dough beside him. James nodded, unable to hide the anxiety that had been gnawing at him. I can't stop thinking about it, Anne. What if she really is family? What if she could help Sophie? And paused her work and looked at him with understanding. I get it, James, but you need to be patient. If she's meant to come back, she will. James knew and was right, but patience wasn't easy when so much was at stake. The thought that this woman might hold the key to saving Sophie was almost too much to bear, but all he could do was wait and hope. Finally, after nearly a week of agonizing anticipation, the bell above the door rang, and there she was. The woman who had left James with so many questions stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the bakery until they landed on him. James froze, his heart pounding as she approached the counter. This time, she didn't order anything. Instead, she looked directly at James, her expression serious but kind. James, right? She asked, her voice soft. He nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, ma'am. She smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I realized something. You mentioned your mother's name was Lily Sullivan? Yes, James replied, his voice trembling slightly. The woman took a deep breath. James, my name is Lucy. Lucy Sullivan. Lily was my sister, my twin sister. The words hit James like a tidal wave, almost knocking the breath out of him. Your sister? He whispered, barely able to process what he was hearing. Lucy nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I haven't seen Lily in years. We were separated when we were young, sent to different foster homes. I tried to find her later, but by the time I did, it was too late. I didn't know she had children until you mentioned her name last week. James felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. All this time, he and Sophie had thought they were alone, but here was a piece of their mother's past, a family connection they never knew existed. Sophie's my little sister, James said, his voice cracking with emotion. She's sick, really sick. She needs a heart transplant, but we don't have the money. Lucy's face softened with compassion as she reached out and took James' hand in hers. James, I'm so sorry you've had to go through all of this alone. I wish I had known sooner. James looked at her, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. Do you think you could help us? Lucy didn't hesitate. Yes, James. I'll do everything I can to help. I want to meet Sophie, and I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me. James felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. Thank you, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you so much. Anne, who had been quietly observing the conversation from the back of the bakery, stepped forward, her eyes warm with approval. It's good to see family coming together, she said softly. Lucy smiled at Anne, then turned back to James. How about we go see Sophie now? I'd love to meet her. James nodded, feeling a surge of emotion he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Relief that he wasn't alone, that someone else cared about Sophie as much as he did. He quickly gathered his things and followed Lucy out of the bakery, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The walk home felt surreal. James kept glancing up at Lucy, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that she was real, that she was his mother's sister. He wondered what Sophie would think, how she would react to meeting their aunt for the first time. When they reached the apartment, James hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "She's probably resting," he said quietly, "but she'll be so happy to meet you." Lucy nodded, her expression softening. "I'm sure she will, and I can't wait to meet her." James pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The apartment was small and modest, but Lucy didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were focused on Sophie, who was lying in bed, her pale face turning toward them as they entered. "Sophie," James said gently, walking over to her, "I have someone I want you to meet." Sophie's eyes widened as she looked at Lucy, her gaze shifting from her brother to the woman standing beside him. Who is she?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. James smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and hope. "Sophie, this is Lucy. She's our aunt." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Lucy, a mixture of shock and joy washing over her. "Really?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Lucy knelt down beside the bed, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm your mom's sister, and I'm so happy to finally meet you." Sophie's face lit up with a smile, and in that moment, the room seemed to fill with warmth and light. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope, a real, tangible hope that things might just turn out okay. As James watched his sister and aunt embrace, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone anymore. And with Lucy's help, maybe, just maybe, they could save Sophie. The days after Lucy's arrival felt like a whirlwind for James and Sophie. Having their aunt suddenly become part of their lives was both overwhelming and comforting. Lucy was a living connection to their mother, a connection they hadn't even known existed. For Sophie, who had been so isolated by her illness, Lucy's presence was like a burst of sunshine in a dark room. Lucy didn't waste any time in taking action. After meeting Sophie and seeing the severity of her condition, she immediately began making phone calls, reaching out to contacts, and researching every possible avenue to get Sophie the help she needed. It was clear that Lucy was determined to do whatever it took to save her niece. One afternoon, as James sat at the kitchen table, going over his homework, he overheard Lucy on the phone in the living room. She was speaking in a low, urgent tone, discussing Sophie's medical situation with a doctor. The conversation was filled with medical jargon that James didn't fully understand, but the serious tone made his stomach twist with anxiety. When Lucy finally hung up, she walked into the kitchen, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "James," she said softly, sitting down across from him, "I've spoken to a specialist in Chicago. He's one of the best pediatric cardiologists in the country, and he's agreed to take on Sophie's case." James looked up, hope and fear battling for control inside him. "What does that mean? Can he help her?" Lucy nodded, though her expression remained serious. "He thinks there's a good chance, but it's going to be a long road. We need to get her on the transplant list as soon as possible, and there will be more tests, more treatments. It won't be easy, but it's the best shot we have." James swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. How much will it cost? Lucy reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his. "Don't worry about that, James. I've already spoken to some of Mom's old friends, people who loved her and would want to help. We'll find a way to cover the costs. I promise." James felt a wave of relief, though the fear still lingered at the edges of his mind. "Thank you, Lucy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Lucy squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me, James. We're family, and family takes care of each other." As the days passed, Lucy became a constant presence in their lives. She would spend hours sitting with Sophie, talking to her about their mother, telling stories from their childhood that made Sophie laugh and sometimes cry. It was clear that Sophie was growing stronger emotionally, even as her physical condition remained fragile. The bond between the three of them grew deeper with each passing day. One evening, as the sun set over the town, casting a warm glow through the apartment windows, Lucy suggested something that surprised James. "Why don't we go for a walk?" she asked, looking at Sophie with a gentle smile. It doesn't have to be far, just around the block. I think it would do us all some good to get a little fresh air. Sophie hesitated, glancing at James for reassurance. She had been so weak for so long that the idea of going outside, even for a short walk, seemed daunting. But there was a spark of determination in her eyes, a desire to feel normal, if only for a little while. I'd like that, Sophie said softly, nodding. With James on one side and Lucy on the other, they carefully helped Sophie out of bed and into her warmest coat. The late autumn air was crisp, but not too cold, and the streets were quiet as they stepped outside. For Sophie, it was the first time in months that she had been outside, and she breathed in the cool air as if it were the most precious thing in the world. They walked slowly, with Sophie leaning on both of them for support. As they moved down the sidewalk, James couldn't help but notice how much stronger Sophie seemed with Lucy by her side. There was a light in her eyes that had been missing for so long, and it filled him with a mixture of hope and pride. Do you remember when we used to go on picnics with Mom? Lucy asked, breaking the comfortable silence as they walked. She would pack those peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that always got squished in the basket, but we didn't care. Sophie smiled, her eyes brightening at the memory. And she'd bring those little juice boxes with the straws that were impossible to open. James laughed, the sound light and genuine. I remember. She always ended up having to help us with them. Lucy chuckled, her heart warming at the shared memories. She was good at that, making everything better, even the little things. As they rounded the corner back toward the apartment, Sophie's steps began to slow. The short walk had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, but she didn't complain. She had felt alive, really alive, for the first time in a long while. When they returned to the apartment, Sophie was exhausted but happy. Lucy helped her back into bed, tucking the blankets around her with a tenderness that made James' chest tighten with gratitude. Thank you for that, Sophie whispered as she drifted off to sleep, her voice filled with contentment. Lucy brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's forehead and smiled. Anytime, sweetheart. After Sophie had fallen asleep, James and Lucy sat together in the quiet of the living room. The weight of the day settled over them, but there was also a sense of peace, a feeling that, for the first time, they were moving in the right direction. We'll get through this, James, Lucy said softly, her eyes meeting his. Sophie's a fighter, and she has us. We'll do whatever it takes to help her. James nodded, his heart full. I know we will, and I'm so glad you're here, Lucy. I don't think we could have done this without you. Lucy smiled, tears shining in her eyes. I'm glad I'm here too, James, and I'm not going anywhere. As they sat together in the fading light, James felt a sense of hope and strength that he hadn't felt in a long time. With Lucy by their side, he knew they had a fighting chance, and that was all he needed to keep going. Winter settled over the town with a quiet intensity, bringing with it the first hints of snow that dusted the streets and rooftops. For James, Lucy, and Sophie, the season brought a mix of hope and anxiety. Sophie's name had finally been added to the transplant list, a moment that should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, it was filled with the uneasy realization that all they could do now was wait. The days stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. Sophie's condition remained fragile, and though she tried to stay cheerful, there were moments when the weight of it all became too much for her to bear. James and Lucy did everything they could to keep her spirits up, filling the apartment with warmth and laughter despite the growing tension. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the Christmas tree casting a gentle light over the room, Sophie turned to Lucy with a question that had been on her mind for days. Aunt Lucy, Sophie began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. What if the call never comes? What if they don't find a heart in time? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. James, who had been decorating cookies at the kitchen table, froze, his hand tightening around the icing bag. He had been trying so hard not to think about that possibility, but hearing Sophie voice it out loud made it feel all too real. Lucy, who had been sitting beside Sophie on the couch, took a deep breath and reached out to gently take Sophie's hand in hers. Sophie, she said softly, her voice filled with a calm reassurance. I know it's hard to wait. It's the hardest thing in the world, not knowing when or if the call will come. but I want you to know that we're doing everything we can. And we're not giving up, not for a second." Sophie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm scared, Aunt Lucy. I try not to be, but I am." Lucy pulled Sophie into a gentle hug, holding her close. "It's okay to be scared, sweetheart, but you're not alone. We're here with you, every step of the way." James set down the icing bag and joined them on the couch, wrapping his arms around both Sophie and Lucy. "We're in this together, Soph," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his heart. "No matter what happens, we're going to keep fighting." Sophie squeezed their hands, drawing strength from the two people she loved most in the world. "I know," she whispered, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And that makes it a little less scary." As the days turned into weeks, their small family settled into a routine of sorts. Lucy continued to juggle her work, her efforts to raise money, and her constant search for more options to help Sophie. James divided his time between school, the bakery, and home, where he spent every moment he could with Sophie. They filled the days with as much joy as they could muster, watching movies, playing games, and sharing stories about their mother. Christmas came and went, the holiday season bringing a brief respite from their worries. They celebrated with a small tree, handmade decorations, and gifts that meant more because of the love behind them. Lucy had even managed to find a small teddy bear, much like the one James had once longed to buy for Sophie, and the look on Sophie's face when she unwrapped it was enough to make the whole day feel magical. But as January approached, the waiting grew more difficult. Every time the phone rang, James and Lucy would freeze, their hearts leaping with hope, only to be disappointed when it wasn't the call they were waiting for. The silence that followed those moments was heavy, filled with the unspoken fear that time was running out. One particularly cold afternoon, James returned from the bakery to find Lucy sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She looked up as he entered, and James saw the exhaustion in her eyes. "Lucy, what's wrong?" he asked, setting down his bag and crossing the room to her side. Lucy sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just got off the phone with the hospital. They're still looking, but they're not optimistic about finding a match soon. Sophie's condition is so specific, and the pool of donors is so small." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "So, what do we do?" "We keep waiting," Lucy said, her voice trembling slightly, "and we keep hoping. That's all we can do." James nodded, though his heart ached with frustration. He wanted to do more, to take action, to somehow force the universe to give them the miracle they so desperately needed. But there was nothing he could do but wait and hope, a reality that was becoming harder and harder to accept. That night, as he sat by Sophie's bed, watching her sleep, James felt the helplessness threatening to overwhelm him. He reached out and gently took her hand, holding it in his as if he could somehow transfer his strength to her. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, not even sure who he was pleading with. "Please, don't let her suffer. She deserves so much more." The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional attempt to lift Sophie's spirits. Lucy and James did their best to keep things normal, but the weight of the situation was starting to show. Sophie, sensing their worry, tried her hardest to stay positive, but even she had moments when the fear was too much to hide. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting and the first stars were beginning to appear in the sky, the phone rang. James and Lucy, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, both jumped to their feet, their hearts racing. Lucy reached the phone first, her hand trembling as she picked it up. "Hello?" There was a pause, and then James saw the color drain from Lucy's face. "Yes, this is Lucy Sullivan. Yes, I'm Sophie's aunt." "Oh, God. Yes, of course, we'll be there right away." She hung up the phone and turned to James, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and disbelief. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they found a match. They found a heart for Sophie." James felt the world tilt around him, his vision blurring as tears filled his eyes. "Are you serious? Is this really happening?" Lucy nodded, her own tears spilling over. "Yes, James, it's happening. We need to get her to the hospital right now." In a flurry of motion, they rushed to wake Sophie, who, upon hearing the news, broke into tears of joy and fear. Within minutes, they were in the car, driving through the snowy streets toward the hospital, their hearts pounding with a mix of terror and hope. As they sped through the night, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that could save Sophie's life. And as the hospital loomed ahead, James reached out and took Sophie's hand, holding on tightly. "We're here, Soph," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We're here, and you're going to be okay. I promise." And as they pulled up to the hospital entrance, James felt a surge of hope unlike anything he had ever felt before. The waiting was over. Now, it was time to fight for Sophie's future. The hospital was a flurry of activity as soon as they arrived. Doctors and nurses were waiting for them, guiding Sophie through the maze of hallways to the pre-surgery area. The sterile, white walls and the harsh overhead lights made everything feel surreal, as if they were in a dream or a nightmare. James held Sophie's hand the entire time, refusing to let go as they moved closer to the operating room. Lucy stayed close by, her calm demeanor masking the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had to be strong for Sophie, for James, but inside, she was terrified. They were standing on the brink of a miracle or a tragedy, and the uncertainty was almost too much to bear. As they prepared Sophie for surgery, a nurse led James and Lucy to a small waiting room just outside the operating theater. The room was quiet, with a few chairs, a low table stacked with outdated magazines, and a television mounted on the wall that no one bothered to turn on. The walls were painted a soft, soothing color, but nothing could ease the tension that filled the air. James felt numb as he sat down, his hand still holding Sophie's until the very last second when a nurse gently told him they needed to take her into surgery. He watched, helpless, as they wheeled her away, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed. Sophie gave him one last, weak smile before the doors closed behind her, and James felt his heart constrict painfully. He sank into a chair, his hands trembling in his lap. Lucy sat beside him, placing a comforting arm around his shoulders. "She's in good hands, James," she said softly, though her voice wavered. "The doctors here are the best. They're going to take care of her." James nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. He leaned into Lucy's side, drawing what comfort he could from her presence. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as they sat in silence, waiting for news. The hours that followed were some of the longest and most agonizing of James' life. Nurses and doctors passed by the waiting room, their faces calm and professional, but none of them brought any news. The quiet was unbearable, the uncertainty a heavy weight pressing down on them both. At some point, a nurse came in with a tray of coffee and sandwiches, but James couldn't bring himself to eat. The thought of food made his stomach churn. Lucy tried to get him to take a few sips of coffee, but he just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the clock on the wall as it ticked on and on. As the night wore on, the waiting room grew colder, or maybe it was just the chill that had settled into James' bones. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, lying on the operating table, her life in the hands of strangers. He kept replaying the moment she was taken away, her frail body, her brave smile. He couldn't lose her, not after everything they had been through. Lucy sat beside him, her hand resting on his back, rubbing slow, comforting circles. She didn't say much, knowing that words wouldn't help. Instead, she stayed with him, offering silent support as they waited together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the waiting room opened, and a surgeon in scrubs walked in. His face was covered by a mask, but his eyes were tired, and there was a gravity in his expression that made James' heart lurch in his chest. James and Lucy stood up simultaneously, their bodies tense with anticipation. The surgeon pulled down his mask, revealing a kind, but weary smile. "The surgery went well," he said, his voice steady. "Sophie is stable, and the new heart is functioning as it should. She's in recovery now, and the next 24 hours will be critical, but so far, everything looks promising." James felt a wave of relief so intense that his knees nearly buckled. Lucy caught him, holding him up as tears filled his eyes. "She's okay?" he whispered, barely able to believe it. The surgeon nodded. "She's okay, James. She's strong. and she's got a lot of people rooting for her. We'll be monitoring her closely, but right now, she's made it through the hardest part." James let out a shaky breath, the tension draining from his body. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did both, burying his face in Lucy's shoulder as the emotions he had been holding in for so long finally broke free. Lucy held him tightly, tears streaming down her own face, her relief as palpable as his. "Can we see her?" Lucy asked after a moment, her voice thick with emotion. The surgeon nodded. "She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her in the recovery room. Just be prepared. She'll look very fragile. But she's a fighter, and she's come this far." James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with gratitude. "Thank you for saving her." The surgeon gave them a small, understanding smile. "It's our job, James, but it's people like you and Lucy who really make the difference. Sophie's lucky to have you both." With that, the surgeon led them down the hall to the recovery room. As they approached, James' heart began to race again. He didn't know what to expect, didn't know if he was ready to see Sophie so soon after surgery, but the need to be near her outweighed his fear. When they entered the recovery room, James' breath caught in his throat. Sophie was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped softly, monitoring her vital signs. She looked so small, so pale, her chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Lucy walked over to Sophie's bedside, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "She's going to be okay, James," Lucy whispered, though it sounded like she was reassuring herself as much as him. James stood beside her, looking down at his sister, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and relief. He reached out and took Sophie's hand in his, holding it gently, as if she were made of glass. Her skin was cool to the touch, but there was a pulse, a steady, reassuring pulse that told him she was still here. "We're here, Soph," James whispered, his voice trembling. "You did it. You made it." Lucy stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and for a moment, they just stood there in silence, taking in the reality of the situation. Sophie had made it through the surgery, and though there was still a long road ahead, this was the first step toward a future they had once only dreamed of. As the night wore on, James and Lucy stayed by Sophie's side, refusing to leave her alone for even a moment. They watched over her as she slept, their hearts full of hope and gratitude. It had been a long, grueling night, but they had made it through together. For the first time in a long while, the darkness didn't seem so overwhelming. The first light of dawn was starting to creep through the hospital windows, and with it came a new sense of possibility, a future where Sophie could live, where she could be happy and healthy again. And as James sat beside his sister, holding her hand, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. The days following Sophie's surgery were a blur of cautious optimism and tense waiting. Sophie remained in the hospital, surrounded by the hum of machines and the constant vigilance of the medical staff. James and Lucy were there every day, keeping a silent vigil at her bedside, willing her to wake up, to show some sign that she was coming back to them. Sophie's recovery was delicate. Every hour brought a new set of challenges. The doctors were pleased with the initial progress, but they were careful to remind James and Lucy that the road ahead was long and uncertain. There were still risks, infection, rejection, and the simple fragility of a body that had endured so much. James held onto Sophie's hand as much as he could, as if the connection between them could somehow strengthen her. He spoke to her often, whispering stories and memories, reminding her of the life that awaited her when she woke up. Lucy did the same, telling Sophie stories about their mother, about the times they had spent together as children, about the love that had always bound them. It was on a cold, quiet morning that Sophie first began to stir. James was sitting beside her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, when he felt her fingers twitch in his hand. He froze, not daring to believe what he had just felt. Then it happened again. A small, weak movement, but unmistakably real. "Sophie?" James whispered, his heart pounding as he leaned closer. "Sophie, can you hear me?" Sophie's eyelids fluttered, her breathing shallow but steady. Slowly, Her eyes opened, and she looked up at James, her gaze unfocused at first, but then slowly sharpening as she recognized him. James! Her voice was barely audible, raspy and thin from the ventilator, but it was there. She was there. Tears welled up in James' eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'm here, sophomore. I'm right here." Lucy, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, woke up at the sound of James' voice. She rushed to Sophie's side, her face lighting up with joy and relief. "Sophie, sweetheart, you're awake," Lucy said, her voice trembling with emotion. Sophie blinked, looking between James and Lucy as if trying to piece together where she was and what had happened. Am I okay?" she asked weakly, her eyes searching theirs for reassurance. James nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You're okay, sophomore. The surgery went well, and the doctors say you're going to get better." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she took in their words. She was still weak, still so fragile, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. "I was so scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I wouldn't wake up." Lucy leaned down, gently brushing a tear from Sophie's cheek. "You're so strong, Sophie. You made it through the hardest part. Now, you just need to rest and get better. We're going to be right here with you the whole time." Sophie nodded, her eyes closing again as exhaustion overtook her. But this time, it was a peaceful sleep, a rest that she so desperately needed. As the days passed, Sophie's strength slowly began to return. It was a gradual process, full of small victories. Her first smile, her first sip of water, the first time she was able to sit up in bed with help. Each milestone was met with quiet celebration, each step forward a testament to her resilience. James and Lucy became fixtures in the hospital, their lives revolving around Sophie's recovery. The doctors and nurses came to know them well, offering updates and encouragement as Sophie continued to improve. There were setbacks, moments of fear when her progress stalled or when complications arose, but they faced each one together, never losing sight of the goal: to bring Sophie home. One afternoon, as the winter sun streamed through the hospital windows, Sophie looked at James with a determined expression. "When can I go home?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. James smiled, though his heart ached with how much he wanted that too. "Soon, sophomore. The doctors just want to make sure you're strong enough. But it won't be long now." Sophie nodded, though there was a hint of impatience in her eyes. She was tired of the hospital, tired of the constant tests and the sterile environment. She longed for the familiarity of home, for the comfort of her own bed, and the warmth of the apartment where she and James had shared so many memories. Lucy, who had been speaking with one of the doctors in the hallway, entered the room with a bright smile. "I have good news," she announced, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "The doctors say if everything goes well, you might be able to go home by the end of the week." Sophie's face lit up with joy. "Really?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Lucy nodded. "Really? But you have to promise to keep getting stronger and follow all the doctor's instructions, okay?" Sophie nodded eagerly, her determination clear. "I will, Aunt Lucy. I promise." The news lifted all their spirits, bringing a sense of lightness that had been missing for so long. For the first time since the surgery, it felt like they could start to imagine a future beyond the hospital, a future where Sophie could live the life she had always deserved. That night, as James sat by Sophie's bed, he couldn't stop smiling. The relief was almost overwhelming, but it was a welcome change from the fear and anxiety that had been their constant companions for so long. "Sophie," James said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I can't wait to get you home. We're going to do so many fun things once you're stronger. We'll watch movies, go to the park, and maybe even have a picnic like we used to." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with anticipation. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I want to do all those things. And I want you to stop worrying so much, James. I'm going to be okay. I know it." James felt a lump in his throat, but he nodded, unable to speak. Sophie's words were filled with such confidence, such strength, that it made him believe it too. They had come so far, and now, finally, there was light at the end of the tunnel. As Sophie drifted off to sleep, James sat quietly, holding her hand and watching over her. The night was peaceful, the steady rhythm of Sophie's breathing a comforting reminder that they had made it through the worst. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, that road didn't seem so daunting. With Lucy by their side, and with Sophie's incredible resilience, James knew that they could face whatever came next. And as he sat there, the future stretched out before them, full of possibilities that he had once been too afraid to hope for. For now, though, he was content to sit with his sister, to hold her hand, and to savor the moment. The future could wait. Right now, all that mattered was that Sophie was here, she was safe, and she was on the path to recovery. And that was more than enough. The week passed in a blur of final checkups and cautious optimism. Every day brought Sophie closer to the moment she had been longing for, returning home. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and as the end of the week approached, they confirmed what Sophie, James, and Lucy had been hoping to hear. Sophie was ready to be discharged. The morning of her release was filled with nervous excitement. Sophie, still weak but visibly stronger than she had been in weeks, sat up in bed as a nurse helped her get dressed in her own clothes for the first time since the surgery. The hospital gown that had become a symbol of her illness was finally being left behind, and with it, the constant reminders of the fight for her life. James and Lucy stood by, their hearts swelling with pride and relief as they watched Sophie prepare to leave. The room that had been their world for so long now felt like a place they could finally say goodbye to. The past weeks had been a battle, but today was the first step toward a new chapter. "Are you ready, Soph?" James asked, his voice full of anticipation as he helped Sophie stand. She was still unsteady on her feet, but her determination shone through. Sophie nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. "I'm ready, James. Let's go home." Lucy, carrying the small bag of belongings they had accumulated during their stay, smiled warmly at them both. "Home sounds pretty good, doesn't it?" With one final glance around the room, they left the hospital behind. The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts as they drove through the streets that had become so familiar. The winter snow was still thick on the ground, but the sun was shining brightly, casting a golden glow over the town. It felt like a good omen, a sign that things were finally turning in their favor. When they arrived at the apartment, Lucy parked the car, and James carefully helped Sophie out, her steps slow but steady. The sight of their home brought tears to Sophie's eyes. "I never thought I'd see this place again," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. James squeezed her hand gently. "You're here now, sophomore. We're all here." They made their way up the stairs, taking it one step at a time. When they finally reached the door, Sophie hesitated, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The apartment felt warm and inviting, filled with the familiar sense of home. It was a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the hospital, and the comfort of it wrapped around Sophie like a blanket. Lucy had gone ahead to prepare everything for Sophie's return. The apartment was spotless, with fresh sheets on Sophie's bed and a vase of flowers on the kitchen table. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about the love and care that had gone into making this homecoming as special as possible. Sophie walked slowly through the apartment, taking in every detail. When she reached her bedroom, she paused, leaning on James for support. "It's just like I remember," she said softly, her voice trembling with happiness. "But it feels different now, like everything is new." James smiled, guiding her to sit on the edge of the bed. "It is new, sophomore. This is a fresh start for all of us." Sophie nodded, looking around the room. Her gaze landed on the small teddy bear Lucy had given her on Christmas, now sitting on her pillow. She picked it up, holding it close. "I'm so glad we're all together," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Lucy stepped into the room, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're going to take it one day at a time, Sophie. You've come so far, and we'll be with you every step of the way." The next few days were filled with small victories and moments of joy. Sophie's strength continued to grow, though it was clear that her recovery would take time. James and Lucy adjusted their routines to make sure Sophie had everything she needed. They celebrated each milestone: her first walk around the apartment, her first meal at the table, and the first time she laughed without wincing in pain. Sophie's laughter was a sound that James had missed more than he realized. Hearing it now, so light and free, filled him with a sense of peace. It was as if the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long had finally lifted. One afternoon, as they sat together in the living room, Sophie turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "James, what's going to happen now? I mean, after I'm fully recovered?" James looked at her, his heart swelling with love and pride. "Whatever you want, sophomore. We can do anything, go anywhere. The world is yours." Sophie smiled, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "I want to make the most of this second chance, James. I don't want to waste a single day." Lucy, who had been listening quietly, reached out and took Sophie's hand. "You won't, sweetheart. We'll make sure of it, and we'll do it together." As winter began to thaw into spring, Sophie's strength continued to return. She was still under close medical supervision, with regular checkups and a strict regimen of medication, but the worst was behind them. The fear that had once dominated their lives was slowly giving way to hope and anticipation for the future. One sunny morning, Sophie suggested they go to the park, a place she had only dreamed about during her time in the hospital. James and Lucy were more than happy to oblige, and they all bundled up against the lingering chill in the air before heading out. The park was a short walk from the apartment, and as they strolled along the paths, Sophie marveled at the sights and sounds of the world around her. The trees were just beginning to show signs of life, buds forming on the branches, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of new beginnings. They found a bench near the playground, and Sophie sat down, her eyes shining with happiness. "It's so beautiful here," she said, taking in the scene before her. "I feel so alive." James sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That's because you are, sophomore. You're alive, and you have so much to look forward to." Sophie leaned into him, her heart full of gratitude for the life she had been given. "I want to do everything, James. I want to see the world, make new friends, and experience everything I've missed. But most of all, I want to make sure that what we've been through wasn't for nothing." Lucy, sitting on Sophie's other side, smiled at her with pride. "You will, Sophie. You've already shown so much strength and courage. The world is yours for the taking." As they sat there together, watching the children play and the world come back to life around them, James felt a deep sense of peace. The journey they had been on had been long and difficult, filled with uncertainty and fear, but they had made it through. And now, with Sophie healthy and strong beside him, James knew that they could face whatever the future held. The road ahead was still unknown, but it was full of possibilities. And with Lucy by their side, they would never have to face it alone. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park, Sophie stood up, her face radiant with happiness. "Let's go home," she said, her voice filled with hope. "There's so much more to do, and I can't wait to get started." James and Lucy stood with her, and together, they walked back to the apartment, their hearts light with the promise of a new beginning. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as Sophie continued to heal. If you like this exciting story about the dark clouds challenges once hovered over their lives had lifted, don't forget to like the video, by a sense comment of hope on what moved you most, and subscribe to the channel. Overwhelming. And check out the next with exciting each passing story. Day, Sophie's energy returned, and soon, it was as if the frail, sickly girl who had once been confined to a hospital bed was nothing more than a distant memory. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came a new chapter in their lives. James, Lucy, and Sophie had settled into a routine that felt almost normal, something that had seemed impossible not so long ago. The fear that had once defined their days had been replaced by a quiet confidence that they could face whatever challenges might come their way. One warm afternoon, James and Sophie sat on the front steps of their apartment building, enjoying the sunshine. The air was filled with the sounds of children playing, birds singing, and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was the kind of day that made everything seem right with the world. "Can you believe it's been 6 months since the surgery?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with wonder. James shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "It feels like a lifetime ago. But look at you now, sophomore. You're stronger than ever." Sophie smiled, looking down at her hands, which were no longer pale and frail but full of life. "I feel stronger," she said. "Stronger than I ever have before. And I have you and Aunt Lucy to thank for that." James shook his head. "No, Sophie. You're the one who fought through it all. You're the one who never gave up." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, James. You and Aunt Lucy, you saved me." James felt a lump form in his throat, and he looked away, blinking back tears. "We're just glad you're here, sophomore. That's all that matters." Just then, Lucy stepped out of the apartment, carrying a picnic basket. "Are you two ready?" she asked, smiling at them. Sophie's eyes lit up. "Ready for what?" Lucy grinned, setting the basket down on the steps. "I thought we'd have a picnic at the park. It's a beautiful day, and we haven't done anything special in a while." Sophie and James exchanged excited looks. "That sounds perfect," Sophie said, her voice brimming with happiness. They gathered their things and walked to the park together, the familiar path now filled with memories of laughter and healing. When they arrived, they found a shady spot under a large oak tree, spreading out a blanket and unpacking the picnic basket. The smell of fresh sandwiches, fruit, and homemade cookies filled the air, and Sophie's face lit up with joy. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, filled with stories, jokes, and plans for the future. They talked about everything they wanted to do now that Sophie was healthy, trips they would take, new hobbies they would try, and the simple joys of everyday life that they would never take for granted again. After they had eaten their fill, Sophie leaned back against the tree, looking up at the sky. "I used to wonder if I'd ever get to see the world," she said softly. "Now, I feel like I can do anything." James lay back on the blanket beside her, gazing up at the clouds. "You can, sophomore. The world is yours." Lucy smiled at them both, her heart full. "And we'll be there with you every step of the way." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the park, enjoying the sunshine and the simple pleasure of being together. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass, Sophie sat up, looking out over the park with a thoughtful expression. "What's on your mind, Soph?" James asked, sitting up beside her. Sophie glanced at him, a smile playing on her lips. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through. I know it was hard, and there were times when I didn't think I'd make it. But now, looking back, I realized that all of it, the pain, the fear, the waiting, it was all worth it." James looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "You're right, sophomore. It was worth it. And now we have the rest of our lives to make the most of it." Lucy, who had been quietly listening, reached out and took both their hands. "And we will. We're going to live every day to the fullest, for all of us, and for your mom. She would be so proud of you both." Sophie nodded, her eyes shining with tears that she quickly wiped away. "I know she would, and I'm going to make sure that every day is a day she'd be proud of." As they sat there, watching the sun set over the park, there was a sense of peace that settled over them. A peace that came from knowing they had faced the darkest times together and had come out stronger on the other side. The future was still unknown, but it no longer held the same fear it once had. Instead, it was filled with the promise of new beginnings, of a life lived to the fullest. And as the last rays of sunlight bathed the park in a warm, golden glow, James, Sophie, and Lucy knew that they were ready for whatever came next. They packed up their picnic and walked home together, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and the warmth of love. The road ahead was wide open, and they were ready to embrace it, knowing that as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. As they reached their apartment and stepped inside, Sophie paused at the door, looking back at the world outside with a smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart full of gratitude for the second chance she had been given. And as the door closed behind them, the promise of tomorrow was bright, filled with endless possibilities and the certainty that they would face it all together.